type of world in which our ancestors lived for hundreds of thousands of years, women probably have 4 to 6 children in a lifetime. Half those children would die before they could reproduce. So the only thing we can be sure about in human population studies is that for the last 100,000 years, people on average had 2 children to succeed them, or there would have been a population explosion 1,000 years ago.
In just the last nanosecond of human history, which began 10,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture, we began to change the way we looked at the earth, something that we separated ourselves from. It is the basis for our civilization today.
We've spread notions of proper sanitation as we've vaccinated for diseases, as we've provided famine relief and basic levels of health care. We see an unintended consequence of our best intentions.
By adding fossil fuels to our agriculture, we have allowed the population to simply skyrocket.
Almost 100 million babies will come into the world this year. The rate increases. More babies mean finally still more babies. When these have reached the age of 40, the world will have doubled its numbers. Helpless, harmless infants.
In the 1960s, population was growing at an unprecedented rate, the highest in human history, as famine developed in South Asia, spreading fear to the rest of the planet.
These are harsh words. They serve to describe the coming crisis in population and food supply that's aptly called the population explosion.
I started talking about the population issue because it hadn't been discussed. People had not made the connection between what was happening to the environment and the fact that our population was growing like a skyrocket. And that's where the population bomb came from. Ann and I wrote it in about 5 weeks of evenings. It was a political track, basically.
The world started grasping the urgency of the situation. Advocacy groups such as Zero Population Growth emerged in the U.S. in the 1960s. For the first time, population growth was linked as a major factor responsible for the global environmental crisis at the first Earth Day in 1970.
Probably the burning of fossil fuels, right?
Probably cars, I would imagine.
Meat.
Meat? Working with that garbage, you know, it's like that's the main thing, in my opinion.
Oh, people.
Oh,
the
people.
Number of people. Okay, that's true.
People,
We're consuming.
yeah. We're
Yeah. 40 years later, the environmental message has not changed. But apart from a few persistent groups, population growth is barely being mentioned. It's as if the issue has been diluted among all others, even though population growth and human consumption are the major factors in our ongoing environmental crisis.
How many people were on the planet the first Earth Day?
About 1 billion.
Maybe over 1 billion?
What do you think the population of the planet is today?
A lot.
It was 3.7 billion in 1970, and
Okay.
now it's 6.8 billion.
Ooh. Oh, yeah.
The problem is not that we haven't had an environmental movement, and that not that some effective things haven't been done. It's a big cultural change, but not fast enough.
Since the first Earth Day, we've had a 5-fold increase in recycling, yet we're producing more trash than we did in 1970.
We are seeing today the 6th mass extinction of species in Earth's history. It is the only one caused by one species, and we're it.
The human species is quite unique in the sense that our consumption pattern is not just given by our appetite. An elephant has a similar consumption pattern no matter what. But people, they can decide not only how to eat, but also how big their houses are and how much else they consume, how many clothes they have, etc. So there's no inherent limit to consumption for an individual. We have a compound problem of rapidly growing populations at the same time as our demand for resources is increasing, but the size of the planet is not. Now we are at global overshoot. Our demand is larger than what nature can regenerate.
And there's no need to think about anything like limits because we've never had to encounter them. We see ourselves as this tiny pimple on a pumpkin or something.
Our world population dynamic today is much different than in 1970. Although it is growing at a much lower rate, it is more than ever at the center of our global crisis. We are adding about 50 million new middle class each year, modeling their consumption habits from the unsustainable lifestyle of the developed world. A triumph for progress and poverty, but a ticking bomb for our civilization. The world is already giving us warnings and clues about the looming global crises that we can't afford to ignore.
Agriculture has always been susceptible to supply-side shocks caused by climatic conditions. We're seeing a different situation now. The demand for agricultural crops is on a strong upward trend.
The demand for food now driven by 3 forces. One is population growth. The second is rising affluence, 2 or 3 billion people trying to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products, and the conversion of grain into fuel for cars. The grain required to fill a 25-gallon SUV tank with ethanol would feed 1 person for a year.
Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1972 for bringing about the Green Revolution, he saw the Green Revolution as a way of buying maybe 30 years in order to solve the population problem. And he said, if we don't do that, we're going to have a terrible situation. And the fact that we're peaking in oil production, which is a key aspect of agriculture almost everywhere, availability of food globally is going to plummet.
The big issue is going to be water. We see in some countries now where farmers are using virtually all the technologies available to raise yields. The market realizes that things are tightening up. As one observer said, land has become the new gold. And the more affluent importing countries are acquiring large chunks of land around the world. It's enormous in scope.
Rising food prices combined with rising unemployment have sparked riots and political unrest.
Every year, there are about 78 million more people living on the planet. That's about 220,000 people every day, competing for both natural resources and for economic opportunities. stretching further the capacity of the world to sustain us. More than half of the world population, the majority in the developing world, is under the age of 28 and is either at or will be at a reproductive age in the next few years. Depending on the kind of choices these youth will take, humanity, according to the UN projections, could be as low as 8 billion or as high as 10.5 billion by 2050. A variance that could make all the difference, as we are beginning to reach many thresholds on the planet.
Population doesn't turn around on a dime. Populations continue to grow. There's a momentum in population today. Even if all the couples in the world were to decide today that they were not going to have more than 2 children, it's estimated that world population will continue to grow to about 8 billion. That momentum means that we have got to, under almost any circumstances, continue to find ways to feed that many people.
I think when I grew up and met JP, who was my husband, and we were going to have kids, and we had our first child, and that was great, a little boy. And we had our second child, a little girl, and that was great. And then I kind of thought, I was kind of imagining we'd have more, but then we had talked about it. JP is from a small family of 2, and he said he really believed in the replacement, that we wouldn't expand the population, that it was a really big belief of his. And I could fully get behind that and understand that intellectually, but there was a feeling in me that was like, you don't really have a family if you can't have a baseball team at any given moment. So I wanted to have a bigger family, and JP is a very kind of a rare, willing mate in that he was up for that too. Adoption seemed like a great way for our family to grow in a way that didn't impact population. So we adopted our youngest daughter, Rato, from South Africa. And I have to say, it feels better to me to have 3 kids. Like 2 felt kind of puny to me. Didn't feel like enough. So I was approached by the producer of this film to be involved because of the work that I've been doing with children's rights. With some friends, I co-founded Mothers Acting Up, which is a movement that invites mothers to see themselves as advocates for the world's children. I was intrigued to learn more about how this issue was impacting children's issues and women's issues.
The population explosion has immediate dangers for us and for our children.
When this issue first burst into public consciousness, population was growing incredibly rapidly. People were making really dire predictions. The world responded, things changed, a lot more women got access to contraceptives, population growth rates came down pretty dramatically all over the world. And so people said, well, that problem is largely solved.
For the last few years, the UN has been revising its predictions upwards in both developing and developed nations.
If we now assume the problem is solved and fail to pay adequate attention to it, we're going to see all of that work undermined.
Over the past few decades, the debate about population has been pushed to the side. One reason is the ongoing stigmatization of the issue, mainly coming from human rights abuses by several countries that have used forced sterilizations and other coercive means to lower their growth rate. The topic of population is also a victim of its own success. The growth rate of the world has been nearly cut in half over the past 50 years. The developed world, primarily Europe and Japan, have seen their decreasing numbers and the aging of their population as a threat to their prosperity.
In many countries, they are paying people what I call bribes